We like to give you a choice. We do. You can choose whether you want to listen to Jamie Raskin or
gentle lady, that it was her that actually organized a trip to the DC jail to hug and high five and sit with the insurrectionists that actually attacked our Capitol. So if we're talking about the safety of DC and the Capitol, it's just quite, I think, ironic. This is all facts. This is quite ironic that the insurrectionists that had tried to overthrow our government in the capital city were being coddled. We're actually being coddled by. It's quite a shame that you call them political prisoners or hostages. I think maybe you called them. They actually try to overthrow our government. Let me continue with my time.
Mr. Chairman, she's not recognized.
Thank you. So I think it's quite interesting that my colleague wants trying to talk about the safety of D.C. When she literally supported an insurrection, an attack on the Capitol, visited the prisoners. I was there as one of 2 Democrats there as part of that visit on behalf of this committee, and seeing her high five folks that want to overthrow our government. So quite ridiculous. And if she's so interested in fixing Washington, D.C., maybe she should run for mayor of D.C. It's what she seems to be interested in. She's obsessed with everything going on. I just want to remind folks that D.C. and the district has a mayor. They have a city council. They're trying to pass regulations. They're trying to work. There's definitely challenges. They're working very hard on those. And overall, let's remember that crime all across the country has actually decreased over the last couple of years. It has not increased. It's decreased. And with that, I yield back my time.
Well, Mr. Would you yield?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for your trenchant remarks, Mr. Garcia. Trying to pierce through the fog of propaganda, confusion, disinformation, and just lies that we just heard. The distinguished gentlelady, who I'd be very happy to yield some of my time to answer the question, started off by complaining about the murder rate in Washington, the carjacking in Washington, and gun violence. And the question that I wanted to pose to the gentlelady, which she anticipated as a stupid question, was simply what she thinks in this legislation that we're here to discuss, 5798, will bring down the murder rate or bring down carjacking or bring down gun violence in Washington. Because the sole purpose of the legislation, as I can read it, is simply to say that the chief of police no longer has disciplinary authority over his or her own police force, but instead it will be subject to collective bargaining. Now, that might be a great policy for the gentlelady's district in Georgia. I'd be interested to know where the municipalities in her district are on that question. But in any event, the people of Washington, D.C. have dealt with this repeatedly. We've got a letter right here, which I submitted for the record, from 12 out of 13 members of the D.C. City Council saying, please don't change our law. We have the statements of 4 different chiefs of police saying, please don't change our law. We've got cops who've been convicted of sexual violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, and I'm not even certain the gentlelady from Georgia understood what she was speaking for, because she was talking about the murder rate and carjacking, and unless she's saying that police officers who may be removed from the force in D.C. for having committed a sexual assault or domestic violence are more likely to help bring down the murder rate, then her remarks are completely nonsensical. It was much ado about nothing. So thank you for allowing me to make that point. I yield back to you, Mr. Garcia.
Would the gentleman yield to a question?
Sure.
You mentioned that crime was down nationwide. Then why isn't it down in Washington, D.C.? You have any idea?
I mean, let me just say, I served as mayor of a city of 500,000 people for 8 years. Crime trends go up and down. You look at overall crime rates, you look at violent crime. Crime overall across the country has gone down. Not everywhere. There are areas of Kentucky and other places in the country that crime has gone up.
Louisville.
But why? But if we're so focused on just D.C., then we should focus on places like Kentucky and Arkansas and Texas and other cities where crime is also slightly going up.
Well, and if the gentleman would yield on that point, there have been increases in different categories in crime in the gentlelady's own state that she represents, Georgia. If collective bargaining is the solution to that, would she support collective bargaining for public workers in Georgia?
Absolutely.
Because it's not allowed there. And she doesn't seem to understand that she just became a champion of collective bargaining and the right to organize a union. And I would invite her to come back to proclaim her new pro-union sympathies publicly for her own state as well.
We would support her on the PRO Act, actually, if she would like to vote for the PRO Act.
Gentlemen's time's expired. Do any other members wish to be recognized? Ms. Norton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my remarks, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter from the D.C. Council opposing this bill.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I strongly oppose this undemocratic and paternalistic bill. This is the 7th bill this Congress, House Republicans have marked up or brought directly to the floor to repeal laws enacted by the duly elected District of Columbia government. Congress has has constitutional authority to legislate on local D.C. matters, but it does not have a constitutional duty to do so. Instead, legislating on local D.C. matters is a choice. House Republicans have repeatedly demonstrated that they believe D.C. residents, the majority of whom are black and brown, are unworthy or incapable of governing themselves. The D.C. Council has 13 members. The members are elected by D.C. residents. If D.C. residents do not like how the members vote, they can vote them out of office. That is called democracy. Congress has 535 full voting members. The members are elected by residents of the states. None are elected by D.C. residents. If D.C. residents do not like how members vote on local D.C. matters, they cannot vote them out of office. This is the antithesis of democracy. The legislative history and merits of the Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Amendment Act of 2022 should be irrelevant, since there is never justification for Congress repealing legislation enacted by D.C. Nevertheless, I would like to set the record straight. The D.C. Council unanimously passed the Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Amendment Act of 2022. While the legislation was enacted without the D.C. mayor's signature, the mayor urged Congress to oppose the disapproval resolution on the legislation. The D.C. Police Department supported removing discipline from collective bargaining, eliminating the 90-day statute of limitations for discipline and allowing the police chief to increase proposed disciplinary penalties to make it easier to fire officers for serious misconduct. Moreover, disciplinary hearings have long been open to the public. Now the public finally can learn when and where they are occurring. The Revolutionary War was forged to give consent to the governed and to end taxation without representation. Yet D.C. residents cannot consent to any action taken by Congress, whether on national or local matters, and pay full federal income taxes. Indeed, D.C. pays more federal taxes per capita than any state, and more federal taxes in total than 19 states. If Republicans cared about our democratic principles or D.C. residents, they would bring my D.C. statehood bill, which will give D.C. residents voting representation in Congress and full self-government to the floor. Congress has the constitutional authority to admit the state of Washington, D.C. It simply lacks the will. I'm deeply concerned about the violent crime spike in D.C., and the D.C. Council is voting on legislation today that it believes will reduce crime. I suggest that Congress knows or cares, more about public policy in D.C. than D.C. is patronizing. I urge members to vote no on this bill.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Glad to yield.
Thank you, Congresswoman Norton. Thank you for that powerful statement. You know, it's your constituents, it's D.C. taxpayers who pay the price for the officers who engage in misconduct that this legislation has set out to rescue. Between 2010 and 2020, the Washington Post found that Washington, D.C. paid out $91 million to resolve claims alleging police misconduct. 65 different officers were named in these multiple claims. It's just baffling to me how you get someone like the representative from Georgia, from a state which doesn't allow public employees to engage in any collective bargaining at all, come to speak for this one very narrow category of dirty cops who've gotten in trouble, who the police chiefs want to have the power to remove from the force.
Time has expired. Chair now recognizes the law enforcement expert on the committee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my colleague and friend, Mr. Raskin, stating that he's baffled, because that's a rare moment when Jamie Raskin will be baffled. But if you were going to be baffled about something, my friend, it would be in the realm of, could we agree, something that you've never personally experienced. And let me say that when a police officer faces accusation, because this is every day, ladies and gentlemen, I truly, respectfully, some of you guys don't have any idea what you're talking about here. And the injury you're bringing into the rank and file of your law enforcement professional is significant. When you take away that insulation of support that individual officers have when they face accusations, which is every day. Let me say that whenever there's been an effort to enhance the ability of the street to impact individual officers that are working patrol, that are on the street immediately picks that up. And the street wants the muscle officers off of the street so that they can run their crime. It's called the game. They in the game on that side, I'm in the game on this side. So when they see that they can push buttons on particular police officers that are working effective patrol, I'm talking about cops that will actually get out of their car and have interaction with citizenry that they're observing. And if you get out of your car in a high drug, a high crime area, you know what you can expect, ladies and gentlemen? You can expect a foot pursuit. And at the end of that foot pursuit, you can expect resistance. And then we're going to effect that arrest. And we're going to find drugs, and we're going to take another drug dealer, another criminal off of the street. In some way, we're going to try. And during this is every day, man. I mean, for some of America, this might sound like a bizarre concept, but for a patrol officer and work in the cities of America today, this is every day, 12-hour shifts. So when you know that if you're squared away, if you're protecting people's civil rights, if you're operating within the parameters of your department's training and policy, if you're handling your business properly on the street, then you'll be protected. You'll be protected because you're going to be accused. But the moment the street figures out that an officer is on his own, of course, the street's going after that guy. Don't you understand? They want that cop off the street. So if they find out they can sue him or pursue him or publicly, have his name listed on a website, what he's accused of course you're going to lose officers, and of course crime is going to increase. So you got to just be humble enough to step back from this reform that was forced through and say, man, that's not working. It doesn't work. We have to protect righteous officers. And I will be, because I love and respect my colleague, Mr. Raskin, and because I named him in my opening, I'm going to yield to him to respond to my...
Well, I just have a question for my dear friend, Mr. Higgins from Louisiana, and thank you for typically insightful and eloquent statement. Do you believe that chiefs of police are aware of the dynamic you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and would you trust the chiefs of police to be able to make determinations about when someone's
sir.
coming in? You don't.
No, sir. You have to trust your organization, your civil service rep, and the infrastructure there, the attorneys and the staff there. You have to trust them because they have power that the chief will respect. As an individual officer, you do not.
So if I could follow up, my question is, do you think that this is a decision that we should make nationally for every state and city in the country, or do you think it should be decided locally by particular
I
communities?
think it should be determined, good question, but as a constitutionalist, I think it should be determined according to constitutional jurisdictional authority. So for this Congress, we only have authority over D.C., and in the sovereign states, I think the sovereign states should determine their course there. And I appreciate the gentleman's dialogue here, and I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. Any other member seek recognition? Chair recognizes Mr. Kosar from Arizona.
Yes, and I yield my time to the chairman.
Thank you, gentleman from Arizona. I just want to add that the mayor of Washington, D.C. and the police chief told us all that about their struggles to recruit and retain police officers when we had our closed-door mayor and police chief briefing right there at that table. There were members from both parties there because I think we all agree that the crime spree in Washington, D.C. Is a huge problem. It's a huge problem nationwide in the big cities, in the blue cities, but it's especially a problem here in our nation's capital. Now, I believe this bill will help because right now, nobody wants to work for the Washington, D.C. police force because they are treated like the enemy by the D.C. Council. And this bill will take steps to change that. And in closing, I want to add that approximately 70% of Metro Police Department's sworn members are Black, Hispanic, or Asian, meaning that the department closely mirrors the makeup of the resident population it serves. Do any other members wish to be recognized? Chair recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to the ranking member.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Frost, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that statement. I'm happy to yield to you if you have any information to contradict me. I don't believe that the mayor of the District of Columbia is supporting this legislation, and I'm not quite sure what how it relates to the problem that you invoke of recruitment shortages on the force. Of course, that's a nationwide problem. I just, as you were talking, flipped online. I found the headlines: Kentucky law enforcement recruiters face tough challenge amid officer shortage. How one Northern Kentucky Police Department plans to deal with officer shortage, and so on. I mean, it's a national problem that's taking place. It's not limited to Washington, D.C. And in any event, I don't see the logic of saying that we're not going to trust the local government, the 13-member D.C. City Council and the mayor, to make this decision for themselves. I don't know exactly what the tally is across the country. I know that in some states, they allow collective bargaining over personnel decisions, and other states have made the same decision that the people of Washington, D.C. have made. In any event, I know that this committee and the Congress of the United States have not done any hearings to replicate the work of the District of Columbia Council and the mayor to decide this. I know that legal challenges were brought to the law that they have that were rejected in the federal courts. And so I think that there would be something kind of flippant and superficial about us just saying that regardless of what's taking place in our own states, in Kentucky or Georgia or Maryland or Texas or Florida, that we'll just decide on the spur of the moment to overturn the studied will of the people of the District of Columbia who've decided this matter and have spent a lot of time working on it. We have not had any hearings in the 8 wards of Washington, D.C. We've not gone out to hear from people in Washington. And, I certainly haven't heard from many of my constituents. I wonder how many of us have heard from constituents who think that the most important thing we need to do to reduce the murder rate in carjacking, as the gentlelady from Georgia suggested, was to overthrow the law of the District of Columbia, allowing the chief of police to control who's hired and who's fired and who's promoted and who's not. I mean, that just seems to me to be a complete non sequitur and, an exercise in absurdity. During some of her heckling of our colleagues, the gentlelady from Georgia described the January 6th insurrectionists, who I know are close to her heart, as political prisoners and as hostages. I'm sorry, the Proud Boys are not political prisoners like Nelson Mandela or Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The Oath Keepers are not hostages like the people being held, Israelis and Americans being held by Hamas. A hostage is someone who has been illegally abducted by a criminal organization and held for a financial or a political ransom. And the thought that they would compare people, a majority of whom have pled guilty for assaulting federal officers, destroying federal property, or engaging in seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government, to hostages or to political prisoners, demonstrates the complete collapse of critical thinking skills on that side of the aisle. I would hope some of Ms. Greene's colleagues, not just on the Democratic side, but on the Republican side, would at least disassociate themselves from the claim that that convicted January 6th insurrectionists are political prisoners or hostages. I know that Donald Trump has trafficked in such foul abuse. I know that Elise Stefanik has repeated his claims for her own reasons, but I would hope that others would maintain the essential semantic, logical, rational, and moral distinction between people who have been convicted of assaulting our officers and people who've been abducted by terrorist organizations. I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I yield back.
Any other members wish to speak? The chair recognizes Mr. Groffman from Wisconsin.
Yeah, I'm going to yield a little time to Congressman Gosar.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. To the ranking member, I hope that all those January 6 folks got their due diligence and due process. I really hope so. Because if they didn't, that is a total violation. And the gentleman should know that. And hopefully you'll get a chance to see and ask that very same question to those individuals.
But by all means, and if you'd yield for a question, are you aware of a single January 6 defendant who did not receive due process?
Well, I can tell you one thing, the exculpatory evidence was restricted.
I'm sorry?
The exculpatory, I think it's called exculpatory.
Yeah, the Brady evidence.
Restricted, and that was the access to the videos, the active videos. So if that had something to do with
it. The videos are public. Have you found a single snippet on any of the videos that contradicts any findings either in court or...
Yes.
Well, which one is that?
The shaman.
I'm sorry?
Not the shaman guy, the guy with the horns.
Yeah.
He did not go ransack the offices. They showed him peacefully going in with officers and coming back out.
I completely disagree with that.
Because here's what happened. He was in prison, and they immediately let him out. So I've also heard from the other side of the aisle that there was officers killed. There was not a single officer killed in that aspect. So let's set the issues right.
I think that the family of Officer Gary Sicknick would beg to differ with you, sir. The defense counsel had access to all of the video. And the shaman...
My time.
It's Mr. Gosar's time.
My time. So no, we have evidence that the timeline that was given on Mr. Sicknick's death did not correspond because they had timelines in which he's in the crypt when he's supposed to be dead. So there's things that don't match up. Yes, go back to the record. I got to tell you, when I hear inaccurate comments from both sides, it bothers me. And you have inaccurate comments right there.
You're saying that Gary's... If I could just... Are you saying that Officer Gary Sicknick did not die after the violent events of January 6th took place?
No. The time in which he was reported dead is not right because he's shown in the crypt actually taking some posters from some of the folks that were petitioning.
Okay.
You got to be careful with these things.
But I don't want us to tread into a territory where we're deeply offending the family. In any event, every criminal defendant, January 6th criminal defendant, has the right to appeal his or her case. There's not a single case that has been overthrown by an appeals court because their due process rights were violated, unless I'm not aware of one.
I just showed you one, the shaman.
That was overturned?
What's that?
That was overturned by an appeals court?
It was overturned because they showed evidence that he was never given during his trial.
Okay, then I will stand corrected if his conviction was overturned, but I was not aware of that. And
it was.
But for the many hundreds of other people convicted of violently assaulting our officers, there have been no due process reversals, and I'm going to check about the.
I got to tell you,
the shame.
It'll be something hopefully you'll get a chance to ask directly because I think it's that important to democracy.
I agree with you that the criminal defendant's rights should be respected. I'm not quite sure, what that has to do with, the legislative matter before us.
I agree. But I was just answering you because
right, and I was responding to just the shouted claims about hostages and political prisoners, which somehow entered into the conversation when Ms. Green was heckling one of our colleagues. But let's put it this way. If you believe that there have been due process violations of a whole class of prisoners, which is what I've been hearing from the gentlelady from Georgia and others, let's have a hearing about that and let's determine if you really believe that. I also heard her say at the beginning that it was really Antifa. I heard her invoke Antifa in sort of her drive-by remarks, and that was something that the former president said. It was really Antifa. Sometimes they blame it on the FBI, but then the rest of the time they're down at the D.C. Courthouse demanding that these people be released from jail. So I don't know why they're protesting for Antifa if it was really Antifa fighters that they want to blame it on.
What I would tell the gentleman, he sounds like he's got a lot of questions like I do. I'd like to have them answered.
Well,
with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you kindly.
Gentleman yields back. Seeing no further requests to speak, the question is now on the Garbarino Amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 5798 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is ordered by Mr. Gosar as previously announced. Further proceedings on the question will be postponed. So we're skipping. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 7184, the Congressional Budget Office Data Access Act. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 7184, the Congressional Budget Office Data Access Act, a bill to provide the Congressional Budget Office with necessary authorities to expedite the sharing of data from executive branch agencies.
Without objection, the bill shall be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection to order, the chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of substitute. The clerk will please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7184 as offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for statement on the bill and amendment. The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, is the legislative branch agency responsible for helping Congress accurately analyze the budgetary impact of proposed legislation. The Congressional Budget Act of 1974 authorized CBO to collect information and data directly from agencies. Timely access to agency data is necessary for CBO to produce accurate cost estimates for legislation and prepare for other congressional reports. However, agencies often delay or restrict CBO's access to data. One of the most common reasons agencies restrict CBO's access to federal agency data is because of perceived Privacy Act obstacles. This bill, the Congressional Budget Office Data Access Act, solves this problem by granting CBO the same Privacy Act exemption afforded to the Government Accountability Office and Congress. Under existing law, CBO must meet the confidentiality standards required by the agency that is providing the data, and this bill maintains that standard of confidentiality while expanding CBO's data access authority, such access that GAO and Congress already possess. CBO access to agency data is critical for the legislative branch agency's ability to fulfill its mission. I thank my colleagues, Representative Grothman and Representative Mafume, for their work on this much-needed legislation. I encourage my colleagues to support this bicameral, bipartisan bill. I now yield to Ranking Member Raskin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend Chairman Grothman and Ranking Member Mfume for introducing this good government common sense measure. It would accelerate the speed and improve the accuracy with which the CBO analyzes the budgetary impact of proposed legislation by providing CBO with an exemption to the Privacy Act. Despite an existing mandate for agencies to provide information to CBO, obstacles remain, particularly around Privacy Act restrictions on sharing data. The bill wisely leaves in place existing law that requires CBO to treat any information it receives with the same level of confidentiality as the agency from which it's received. I urge colleagues to support the legislation. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Do we enter any, Chair now recognizes Mr. Grothman, the sponsor of the bill, from us.